we want to watch a little bit of Jason Brennan, who is a libertarian philosopher, and in the lecture that we're about to watch, a little bit of the lecture, he is going to talk about one of my favorite 20th century philosophers, this dude, G.A. Cohen, who is this really important Marxist analytic philosopher, and it's going to sort of lead into his argument about Cohen, and we're going to kind of stop just before that, but let's watch that first part.
In a capitalist society, the means of production are allowed to be privately owned, though even in a capitalist society, things are collectively owned. I mean, I have a retirement account with Georgetown, and it's a bunch of mutual funds, which I'm sharing ownership of a bunch of companies, I don't even know which ones, collectively with millions of other people, right? So in a capitalist economy, individual decisions about economic matters are allowed. And in a socialist economy, these things are going to be decided somehow collectively. That's how economists tend to use the word. You can break it down more fine-grained, and actually a number of different institutes, such as the Fraser Institute, which is a think tank in Canada, hires a number of economists every year to score countries by how capitalist they are. And this is a map. The blue countries are the most capitalist. The red, red or like the least capitalist, yellow's in between, green's like kind of just below blue. Right? So the most capitalist countries by the Fraser Institute rankings include the countries that the US Americans are inclined to call socialist, like Norway and Sweden and Finland and Denmark, the United States, Germany, Spain, Ireland, Switzerland, and so on. In fact, on this ranking, the US is usually about maybe around 18. Right? Some years, Denmark actually ranks higher and more capitalist. So here's what I think might be going on with Michael Moore. He thinks that the word socialism has a kind of dirty meaning to people, at least older people, because we all kind of accept this sort of story from the 20th century. The story goes like this. In the 20th century, the world experimented with two fundamentally different modes of economic organization. In some countries, like Cambodia, Vietnam, USSR, China, Cuba, and so on, they experimented with having collective ownership of the means of production, with socialism. And those countries didn't do very well. They didn't do very well in particular for poor proletariat workers. The very people who were supposed to be liberated by socialism were in fact hurt by it. They had a stagnant standard of living and their lives did not go better. Other countries like South Korea, Canada, Australia, Switzerland, Denmark, Sweden, Norway experimented with capitalist modes of production, and their people got to be a lot richer. And so as a result, maybe like we think, oh, we had this debate, there's nothing more to debate between socialism and capitalism, the debate is over. I mean, don't the facts speak for themselves? And what I'm going to say is, well, maybe not, but here's what some of the facts might be. In the year 1900, 95% of people alive lived in what the UN would consider extreme poverty, on less than what would now be $1 a day. Almost everyone everywhere throughout all of history was dirt poor and just on the verge of starvation. Today, by that same measure of extreme poverty, less than 10% of people are living in extreme poverty. In my lifetime, extreme poverty has dwindled down to almost nothing, and it continues to shrink. That's pretty cool. I'm pretty happy about that. It turns out that when you take the Fraser Institute's ranking of how capitalist countries are, the more capitalist a country is, the richer it tends to be on average. In fact, you can even see there's the trend line, and you might notice the more capitalist countries are significantly above the trend line. They tend to be richer than the non-capitalist countries. But if you're an egalitarian, if you care about the poor, you don't just care about averages. You want to know about how the worst off people do. But it also turns out that the worst off people in capitalist societies tend to make significantly more money than like average people in non-capitalist societies. So all the dollar amounts I give you through this entire talk, they're all going to be adjusted for purchasing price parity and the cost of living. So these are constant dollars across countries. You don't have to say like, well, it's cheaper to live in, Zaire than like Canada. I put that in the graph. It turns out that if you look at just people at the bottom 10th percentile of income in the most capitalist countries, they earn on average around $11,000 today, which isn't a lot. It's not that great. That's like the standard of living in like the poorest parts of Appalachia, but it's on par with the average standard of living across the entire world. Right? GDP per capita worldwide is around that. And this is also, by the way, that money, that's before they get any kind of welfare payments, any kind of government transfers, anything like that. So in fact, the gap between the so-called poor in the most capitalist countries and the poor in non-capitalist countries is even wider than this graph indicates. It's better to be, if you're living at what we consider the poverty line in the United States today, as a single adult, you're roughly in the top 15% of income worldwide. And again, I'm adjusting for the cost of living and adjusting for purchasing price parity. Some people worry that, well, maybe it makes people richer, but it makes them more unequal. The interesting thing is, it doesn't really matter where you look. You get roughly the same level of wealth, as a percent in all these countries. In the most capitalist countries and least capitalist countries, the worst off people own only about 2.5% of the wealth. But that said, there's actually a negative correlation between how capitalist a country is and how unequal it is. Right? So historically, what you find is as countries become more capitalist, they start to become more equal. And then when they hit about $15,000 to $16,000 GDP per person, they start to become more equal, even before there's any kind of government transfers. So the relationship between the actual empirical relationship between capitalism and inequality is kind of complicated. It's not just simply it causes it or doesn't cause it. It's sort of more of a curve. The curve's called the Kuznets curve, actually. Well, what about looking at the poor? What do they own? They have a lot of stuff. So this is from the US Census Bureau. And actually, I took this one from 2005. If you update it, the numbers are a little bit higher. But you find that the people at the bottom 10th percentile of income in the US, the people at the poverty line in the US, own about 43% of them own their own home. 74% of them own a car. But almost a third own 2 cars or more. Most of them have air conditioning. They all have a refrigerator. Most have a clothes dryer. Many have a dishwasher. A lot have color televisions and so on. And, I'm not saying that filthy lucre makes your life better, perfect. And that's the point of life is to acquire as much stuff as possible. I mean, it is to acquire as many guitars as possible. But other than that, it doesn't really matter. But nevertheless, if you look at the kind of stuff that the poor in the United States own today, it's on par with what was considered middle class in 1970. If you look at ownership rates of these goods in the year 1970, it's actually worse than it is for the poor in the US today. So some progress has been made. This isn't just buying people filthy lucre, it's also buying them life. It turns out that in the most capitalist countries, people have a longer life expectancy than in least capitalist countries. And if you look at things as countries over the last 20 years move up in the Fraser rankings, you also find that life expectancy goes up. When they move down, life expectancy goes down. And the reason for that has to do with there's a pretty strong relationship between GDP per capita and life expectancy, in particular when it comes to child survival rates. In very poor countries, children still die at a young age, and that brings down life expectancy dramatically. And in richer countries, they don't. So there's other numbers here. We could look at things like the poverty rates in certain countries. And you find, again, in the most capitalist countries, extreme and moderate poverty are much lower than in the least capitalist countries. And things like scoring civil and political liberties, they tend to be more protected in the most capitalist countries than the least capitalist countries. It also turns out, this is a work from Betsy Stevenson and Justin Wolfers, that the richer people are, the happier they are, though not that much. Money buys a little bit of happiness, not much, but a little bit. So is there really anything to be said in favor of capitalism, socialism? Didn't we just have this debate in the 20th century? Don't the facts just speak for themselves? Isn't just over? Well, not really, because I think a very common reaction to these kinds of data is that, sure, maybe it works out, but nevertheless, there's still something morally good about socialism. There's still something morally superior about it.
All right. So at this point, he goes into his main subject, which is his critique of that book behind me, Why Not Socialism? And we will talk about the kind of dynamic between Cohen and Brennan on that in just a moment. But first, I want to talk about all of those figures that he just went through and just put so much weight on. That this is really what proves that, as a matter of fact, capitalism works out better than socialism. And at the beginning, he kind of did this thing where he defined socialism as collective control of the means of production, which makes some sense. He he'd made this move where he was like, oh, well, technically, if, a bunch of people own stocks in the same company, then they collectively own it. I was a little unclear where he was going with that, but I think he was clear that that's not what anybody means when they talk about collective ownership, right? As opposed to private ownership. If you sell a little piece of a company to 10,000 people, each get a little piece, then clearly it's private, right? You can buy and sell pieces of it, but this is an important point for where we're going. That he does do that, like relatively clear sounding definition of socialism, but then he uses these phrases like more capitalist and more socialist throughout. So what does that mean? Well, should depend a little bit on what you mean by socialism, certainly. So a lot of socialists, myself included, sort of see the main point as being about workers' control of the means of production. And if that's what we mean, then I don't know how we're measuring that, because there's never been a society where a significant percentage of the economy was under the democratic control of the people in those workplaces. So that seems hard to measure, but there are a couple other things that you might mean by, more capitalist or more socialist that wouldn't be totally counterintuitive and would at least track some of what's typically going on in socialism versus capitalism debates. So one thing, like I said, a lot of socialists say, no, what we're really talking about is worker control, but other socialists say, well, state ownership is good enough, right, to count, right? This is an old debate, within the socialist movement. So there's one position that, like, people like Michael Harrington will say, well, it could be if it's a democratic state, so that sort of ordinary working people are exercising control of it through the state. But if it's not a democratic state, then it's not. Other people, of course, have had very different views and, supported things like the Soviet model of, what was called socialism there. And at least if you mean state ownership, then again, I understand what you're talking about, how you could measure it. You could say, okay, there's societies like the United States where only a very small percentage of the economy is under state ownership. There are economies like the Soviet Union and, up through the end of the 80s where practically everything was state owned. And then there are in-between cases like Norway, where even now, like, almost a third of the public works for the public sector. And, the state at least owns pieces of a lot of private companies. So if that's what you mean, then I would understand what you meant by more capitalist, more socialist. Hold that thought. So yesterday in Jacobin, an article that I wrote about this went up, that this Brennan lecture was part of what brought this to my attention. There's also a paper that I read for other reasons that was another part of what brought it to my attention. And in both cases, you have these libertarians making a huge deal about these Fraser Institute numbers, right? Remember, they said he said in the lecture, this is a think tank in Canada that does these economic freedom rankings, ranks different countries by economic freedom, and then finds out that more economic freedom is correlated with all the good things, and less economic freedom is correlated with all the bad things. And if you want people to have higher standards of living and be more educated and live longer, and that even the poorest people in society, to improve over time and all of this stuff, then you want, more capitalist, because the more capitalist a society gets, the more of all these good things it has. That's the story that Brennan is telling. That's the story that other libertarians have told using this same source, the Fraser Institute's. It's called the Economic Freedom of the World Report. And I think they used to do it less often, like maybe once every 5 years. Now they're putting it out once a year. And this made me really curious. Okay, what do they mean? What's the methodology? And I started to poke into this. And guys, this is spectacularly bullshitty. So the way this works, they rank different countries' level of economic freedom using 5 metrics that are used to, like, award or subtract points to different countries. Which should already be a little suspicious, because, like, honestly, if you want to make some, like, really clear, rigorous claim, like, shouldn't you just kind of like look at one and like see what correlations you could find based on that? But whatever, that's fine. So there are 5 metrics, and some of them sound like they might have something to do with traditional capitalism, socialism debates, like size of government is one, and regulation, is one. There's one category called legal system and property rights. And you hear that, it's like, I understand what property rights are doing there, but what's this legal system and property rights thing? That seems like a weird way to mash together a category. Hold that thought. There's also one called sound money. You think, wait a second, what are we talking about here? And how is it supposed to relate to debates about socialism and capitalism, and whether countries are better off being more free market or more social democratic, like that? And you look into this, and this is actually not unusual. Like there's also a Wall Street Journal / Heritage Foundation economic freedom ranking that pulls the same trick. What they're talking about when they talk about sound money is how much inflation there is, and the justification that they use, if you read the fine print in this report where they like lay out all the categories, is, well, if there's lots of inflation, that robs people of their ability to reap the benefits of their property ownership. So you don't really have meaningful property rights if there's lots of inflation. Now, notice that the order of explanation here is exactly backwards from what you would usually get in right-wing anti-socialist arguments. That usually right-wingers will say, oh, do you know about Venezuela? As an anti-socialist thing, and they'll be saying, oh, all this inflation that happened in Venezuela is proof that socialist policies lead to bad outcomes. But here they're doing the opposite. They're not saying there's something socialist about it, and that's correlated with lots of inflation, therefore socialism is bad. They're just preemptively defining inflation as making societies less capitalist. That's a fun trick. They also, in the legal system and property rights category, that's broken down into 5 subcategories, one of which, I shit you not, is military interference in the legal or political system. So there's also judicial independence and integrity of the legal system. So just to take a step back, and like everything that you just saw Jason Brennan say, there are a couple of places where he mentions other sources, but overwhelmingly the main source he was playing up in that clip that we just watched was the Fraser Institute's economic freedom rankings. But what the hell are these supposed to rank that has anything to do with capitalism versus socialism? Because if you're telling me that societies that have lots of inflation, lots of judicial corruption, and frequent military coups have worse outcomes than societies that are more stable and don't have those things, then yeah, I believe you. But I don't know what any of that is supposed to have to do with anything that's an issue in debates about whether we're better off, having, more capitalist societies or less capitalist societies, as any critic of, like what any critic of capitalism would be like that, right? Critics of capitalism don't say capitalism is bad because there's not enough inflation and there's not enough judicial corruption and there aren't enough military coups, right? If you could show that those things are reduced by otherwise being capitalist, that might be relevant to the debate. But here you're just working backwards, and you could say, okay, well, here are things that are like precious to, like libertarian ideals or whatever, and having those things means you've lived up to those less. Okay, fair enough. But hey, free speech has been really important to lots of socialists historically. We were just talking about Woodrow Wilson putting Debs in jail. We could talk about the free speech movement at Berkeley that helped to kick off the New Left, the struggle against McCarthyism. So lots of leftists have had, free speech has been a really important ideal to us. But if we did a ranking of how socialist different societies were, and because that's an important ideal to us, we said that societies are less socialist if they have less free speech, and therefore we awarded the Soviet Union a lower socialism quotient than the United States, and said, oh, see, more socialism is correlated with more free speech. Well, that doesn't prove anything. And this is essentially what they're doing. And if you think I'm exaggerating, one of the things I point out in this article, Jacobin, is literally, like, if you go, the Fraser Institute on their website, they've got this little interactive map where you can quickly look up different countries and see where they go in the economic freedom ranking. You can compare different countries. Norway and Sweden are both at 37th place overall in the world for economic freedom. Haiti is 118th place. So according to the Fraser Institute, and remember, the way that people like Jason Brennan use the Fraser Institute, they'll say, because he was freely throwing around language about, countries becoming more capitalist or less socialist. That means that Haiti is less capitalist or more socialist than Norway or Denmark. Guys, remind me, which of these places has a bigger welfare state? Which has friendlier laws to labor unions? Which has a bigger public sector? Anything that would actually be intuitively relevant to what people are arguing about when they have capitalism versus socialism debates. Obviously, Haiti is way more capitalist, than Norway or Sweden, if we're going to use that language and not just say, well, you're either capitalist or you're not, and if you have private ownership of the means of production rather than workers control, you're capitalist or whatever. But like, if you are going to talk in that more or less capitalist way, like, which of these places have more social democratic policies that would benefit, working class people? I mean, it's not a serious question. So that's the first thing, just that the way that people like Brennan are using this Fraser data is just bizarre. I mean, it's just like, it takes like 5 minutes of poking around their report on their website and how they explain their findings to show that they're just completely loading the dice for their preferred outcome. You have been watching free public content from Give Them an Argument. To access every single episode of the show, the main show on Monday nights, all of the streams, all of the debate breakdowns, all of the patron-exclusive post-games on Monday nights, all of the patron-exclusive bonus episodes every week, and much, much more, go to patreon.com/Ben Burgis. I cannot resist ending this with, don't be foolish.